You're probably itemizing everyone wrong, and that's okay because there are 60 new champions in the new set. So I'm gonna head on over to bunnymuffins.lol, click on the items at the very top, and check out some of the general item rules, and also check out what I should be building on every single champion. Of course, there are a lot of alternatives on what fits on each champion, and it depends really on what build you are doing. For example, Kalista can be built in many different ways. A lot of people just put generic attack damage items on her, and you'll probably do fine in most cases. But if you want like optimal items, if you're playing 7 multi-striker Kalista, that build is going to be pretty different than building Kalista in like a flex comp or in 6 fairy. In 7 multi-striker Kalista, for example, Rage Blade, which is one of Kalista's most popular item, is still decent, but there are better things to build on her. Alternatively, on 6 fairy, Rage Blade is pretty much mandatory. So I'll try to keep track of that as we go through each and every champion, but also don't forget, tank items, they're generally pretty flexible. On the website, I go through when and why to go every single tank item, but most of the time you're slamming tank items because they're not as picky. However, your carries are a bit different. Another thing is only itemize carries and main tanks because they're pretty much the core of your team. So if you're putting items on other people, you're just like wasting resources. Imagine if you like give your Xbox to one of your cousins and they never touch it, and then there's someone who really wants to play it. Like, come on, that's not an efficient use of resources. And we have limited resources in life just as we do in TFT. So give the Xbox to whoever your main carry is. So for tier 1, we're gonna sort this out from like top left is generally the tanks, top right is like the tanky bruiserish type of people. It like transitions through as you go further. And then bottom right is AP carries, bottom left is AD carries. That's going to be the format for each and every one of these tiers. And of course, for tier 1s, we're going to assume that they have their hero augment. So for Blitzcrank, you're going to assume you're going to have Zap Attack, which makes him deal a bunch of damage, which is really nice. That's why I really like Crown Guard on Blitzcrank. And since you're 3-starring him, getting a bunch of like solid tank items will work out really well. He gets a ton of health. Warmogs gives even more because it's percentage based and gives a flat bonus. Vanguard also scales off of health, which is really nice. And then Crown Guard's really good too because again, Crown Guards love shielding. It gives them extra durability and it gives him much needed AP to help his zap attack zap even harder. Oftentimes you run him as like one of your few tanks in the build, so having Stone Plate is really strong on Blitzcrank. Also a decent item in the early game because every unit kind of focuses in on one person. But of course there are many different alternatives to this zap attack build. Almost any tank item works, and it will depend on your meta. In a AP heavy meta where people are throwing all sorts of magic damage, getting a Dragon Claw is obviously really good. If it's a heavy attack damage meta, Bramble Vest is going to be really good. So always mix and match based on whatever you're facing and whatever's popular in the meta. Next up we have is Lilia. If you get the high horsepower augment, Bloodthirster is really good because she can go what people say like go infinite. And what that means is she like attacks, heals a bunch, takes damage, attacks, heals a bunch, takes damage, etc., going infinite. Crown Guard's also really good on her because again, you want survivability in your frontline tanks and it gives her much needed AP. Ionic Spark, very nice because it reduces the magic resistance of other units. But of course, again, generic tank items will do on her instead of this 3rd item slot. Poppy is interesting. Witchy Wallop Poppy is a very strong augment, but what I think is the most important items on her, by the way, the items highlighted in orange are what I consider mandatory, is going to be Sterex and Bloodthirster. So Sterex is crucial on Poppy because she does not get a lot of attack damage, and Sterex is one way to get a lot of that. Because she's a Bastion and a Witchcraft, these traits don't really scale well with Witchy Wallop, so you really need something like that that gives both like a mix of AD and survivability. Like, as much as I want to put a Deathblade on Poppy, you still need some survivability because she is in the front line, so that's why I like Sterex over something like a Deathblade. IE is also pretty good because she's more of a caster. Casters generally like critting more, whereas auto attackers like having more attack damage. That's another theme you'll notice in this video. A lot of the auto attackers, they're going to go for Deathblade, where a lot of the casters are going to go for Infinity Edge. Next up we have is Elise with Spider Queen. BT, another essential item on her. It just helps her heal a lot. She has built-in healing from the Spider Queen ability itself, but BT's especially good on shapeshifters because it scales off of percent health, and shapeshifters have a ton of health. That's why you also slap a Warmogs on her. And then since she survives so long and she kind of scales as the fight goes really long because she sustains really easily, getting an Archangels on her is definitely pretty good too. Jace and Jax, they do not have hero augments, and while 3-starring them could be nice, you generally don't do it that often. But let's say you do 3-star Jace and Jax, throwing a Thieves Gloves on them, perfectly fine. There aren't really champions that you want to invest too much into at the moment, but hopefully in the future it can change. For example, when you play Jace, maybe there's a reroll portal build in the future where you go Jace 3, Zoe 3. But the thing is, they're better one-cost tanks in that case. You could, for example, have like Elise as your main tank in the front and then Jace as a secondary tank because they're both shapeshifters and they're both one-cost along with Zoe. The reason why you don't want Jace as your main tank is because he gets bonus resistances after he does his first cast, so he needs someone else to tank before he does that first cast. If not, it's a little bit inefficient. Jax is good in like a multi-striker reroll comp. Sometimes you get Jax 3 when you're going Kassadin. Sometimes if you're going Ashe, you get him 3-star also. He is okay to invest in. You could put like Bloodthirster on him and give him a bunch of bruiser items, but I find that works a lot better on other multicasters. So even if you're going 3-star Ashe and 3-star Jax, the other leftover items are probably better suited for something like a Kassadin 3 if you're going for that, or like a Hecarim. That's why I just like putting a Thieves Gloves on Jax if I'm going for him 3-star. Warwick's a bit of a special case. I'm not going to put too many artifact items in this list because we don't get artifact items that often, but I'm going to make a special case for Warwick because he works especially well with the corrupted Vampiric Scepter. The item's literally made for him, so if you ever do get this combo, it is decently strong. Slap a Rage Blade and a Quicksilver to kind of complement that. This thing just heals him a lot and does a lot of damage, and you lose the active portion of his ability, which is perfectly fine because his passive is more than good enough. Rage Blade is so he attacks faster, and QSS is so that he doesn't get interrupted. Whenever you build a Rage Blade on a frontliner, Quicksilver is always going to be the best item to complement it with because the only way to stack Rage Blade is if you don't get crowd controlled. What's the only way to not get crowd controlled? Getting a Quicksilver. Of course, if you get a Banshee's Veil, you could replace this with a third item and get even more damage after that. Next up we have are some of the damage dealers. So AP carries first. Zoe, blue buff, mandatory on her because she has low mana cost, and you just want her just popping off as often as possible. Nashor's helps her cast more, and then Hat, very solid, just gives her more AP because she casts so much. Another thing to note about AP casters is that I'm pretty sure Nashor's is just the best AP item in the game. Pretty much everyone uses it because generally the build for AP casters is 1 mana item, Nashor's, and an ability power item. So for some reason that's almost always the case, and I think they made Nashor's OP because it's made out of belt and bow. And those are kind of like weird components, so they kind of want to encourage people to build it a bit more. Whereas something like a rod, you can always use a rod in an AP comp, right? You could always use a tier in an AP comp as well. So they want to make the bow and belt combo give like something a little extra. That's my theory at least, and that's why Nashor's is pretty much a great item on every single caster. But Zoe's a great carry. There's lots of builds around her with Scholar right now. Seraphine, a bit interesting. I don't think she's like a main carry. I like putting just utility items on her, something like a red buff so that she AoEs people in a line and puts the debuff on them. I think that's a pretty good use for Seraphine. Getting a Shojin on her isn't a bad idea either so that she casts more. Soraka, I think, does a bit better with a few more items, just mana item from the Shojin, Nashor's to cast more, and then Hat just to get more AP. Ability power is really good on mage comps because you kind of double the amount of ability power that you get because they cast twice. So overall, I really like building like Hat or Archangels on a bunch of mages, as you'll notice in a bit. Zig's pretty decent with just a full casting build. He's an incanter, so the more he casts, the better he gets. So Shojin, blue buff, double mana item would be best on him, and then a Nashor's Tooth. One thing to note is that a lot more items work on different champions, but the thing is, I want to set this guide up in a way that says like, hey, if I get like an item anvil and I'm faced with 2 choices, what should I make? Or if you're on carousel, you're like, these 2 options that are both good are available. Which one is slightly better? That's the whole idea behind this guide. Obviously, you're not going to get Shojin plus blue buff on Ziggs that often because 1, Ziggs has to be in the meta. Right now, he's not. 2, you need to get 3 tiers for him, and getting 3 tiers is going to be very difficult because that's a very popular mage item, because again, getting 1 mana item on your mage is almost mandatory. Next up, we have Twitch and Namzi. I don't think there are that many great builds that fit on them right now, so you're just going to TG them if they get to 3-star. Ashe is a pretty solid utility unit from multi-strikers, but she also does a bit of damage. Red buff is really good because she does like a little bit of AoE. Last Whisper is good because, again, she applies it to multiple people. And then Deathblade's really good because she's more of an auto attacker than a caster, so that's why I like Deathblade more than Infinity Edge. But of course, Infinity Edge is all right. It's not bad on her. I would build it early game if those were my starting items, right? But if I'm on a carousel and I see the option between those 2 items, I'm going to pick the Deathblade. Next one up we have are the tier 2 units. Galio, Regular Galio, we're going to go over Deja Vu Galio later. Just generic tank items will do. Stoneplate, Warmogs, and Steadfast Hard, solid combo. He is more of a CC unit, so I like using him as a secondary tank a bit more, but whoever you 3-star that game, that's going to be your tank. So if you're going for like Galio and Rumble as like your tank line, sometimes people also pair it with Mordekaiser. Like obviously Mordekaiser's the best, but if you get a 3-star Galio, just throw the tank items on him. He'll be more than fine with it. Nunu's great. He's the primary tank of the Kog'Maw comp, and any Honeymancer comp, he's just really, really solid. Redemption, I think, is probably the best item on him. Warmogs is generally good on 3-star units, and then Stoneplate, oftentimes when you're running Honeymancer, you're doing like a reroll comp, so you don't have that many units in the game. So getting a Stoneplate on him is not a bad idea. Rumble generally takes any generic tank item, but if you're doing what's it called, like Molten Caramel Rumble, you want Bloodthirster and a lot of AP on him. He scales so well with AP. That's why you want the Jeweled Gauntlet and the hat. It's just a really nice combo on the Rumble, and he's just gonna fry everything with this item build. Next up we have is Shyvana. Shyvana, I want her to be good. She's my favorite League of Legends champion, my most played in the past couple years. However, she is awful in this TFT set. Not awful. She's fantastic in the early game, but once you get into the late game, she becomes one of the worst champions. Even at 3-star, she jumps in and then she just dies. Even with 6 Shapeshifter, she'll still die. She's one of those champions that you want to build around in the early game, but later in the game, you kind of want to build other people. So that's why you just slap a Thieves Glove on her, have her carry in the early game, take you to level 8 or whatever level you need to go to, and then call it a day after that. Next up, we have is Nunu with Sweet Tooth Augment. Sweet Tooth is really good because it works with all types of item builds. I've seen full tank Sweet Tooth Nunu work, and I've seen this more like damagey bruiser build work, where you go Warmogs, Bloodthirster, and Archangel. This build works really well because he gains a lot of permanent health, so Warmogs helps accentuate that. Bloodthirster scales off that too, and then since he lives so long, getting an Archangels isn't a bad idea so that he gets more kills, gets more stacks. Kassadin's really good as a 3-star carry for multi-strikers. Getting a Quicksilver, Rageblade, Bloodthirster is a really solid combo. Bloodthirster is the best item on him. I would not play him without one. Honorable mentions for other items is you could go Edge of Night instead of Quicksilver, and you could also go like Archangels instead of Rageblade. All these builds work. Kind of depends on what situation you're running with the rest of your team and what type of teams you're facing too. But I would say Bloodthirster is absolutely mandatory, and if you're able to get one of the artifact items, Zhonya's Paradox is the best item you can get on Kassadin, minus Radiance. Obviously, if you get like triple Radiant item Kassadin for some reason, like yeah, that's gonna be better than an artifact item, but like in terms of like cost effectiveness, getting an artifact item and getting Zhonya's Paradox is like the best thing ever on Kassadin. Next one up we have is Akali. Akali works in both multi-strikers and in like her Akali Nyla build. Luckily for you, the builds are generally the same. You want Edge of Night. I think that's mandatory item on her. She just jumps around too much, gets hit by too much bull crap, so you need her to survive. And then after that, some healing, more damage is going to be great. So Sterak's Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge Hodge, those are two popular combos. Nyla, great. Bloodthirster mandatory on her because again, she's in the fray. She has 2 range, so she's not as dangerous as Akali, but she's still very upfront, gets hit by a bunch of AoEs, so you definitely want the Bloodthirster on her to heal and to get the shielding. And another point about the Bloodthirster on Nyla is that she gets a bonus attack speed buff when she has a shield on her. So getting the shield from Bloodthirster gives her that bonus attack speed, which makes the item incredibly good on her compared to every other normal item. IE is good for more damage, and then Edge of Night just great for melee frontliners in general. I guess she's not actually melee, she has 2 range, but she's pretty much in there. I think Edge of Night might be the best frontline item of this set because I find that like a lot of times when you don't have it, in the super late game, they kind of just blow up without it. Edge of Night might be the best late game item, but there are probably better ones in the early to mid game. Next one up we have is Syndra. Syndra went through a bit of a identity shift because she went through a pretty big rework where they changed the cast time of her ability. However, you still need Spirit Shojin. That's a mandatory item on her. It's just the best item to get her to cast slot, and since she needs to stack a lot of casts, it pretty much means that the other 2 items don't really matter that much. But of course, Nashor's is great for getting more stacks, and then Red Buff gives her a bunch of attack speed to hopefully get her to cast more. You don't need the Rage Blade as much because again, they change how her ability works. So while it's not bad, I find Red Buff to be a bit better because it gives more utility and it gives you more attack speed earlier on in the fight. Next up we have is going to be Ahri. Blue buff and then AP is going to work great on Ahri. Ahri gets 30% bonus ability power from ability power sources in case you did not know. So that's why you want the hat on her. And then instead of Nashers to get her to cast faster, because you have so much ability power, you want the critical strike chance to kind of multiply that ability power even more. So that's why you go with the JG hat combo. But of course, Nashers is still good. She's one of the rare exceptions of mages that have something even better than Nashers, but that's just because of her passive, which gives her 30% bonus AP. Cassiopeia needs Rageblade, Hextech Gunblade. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. I mean, she just auto attacks a lot as her ability, so you need to auto attack a lot. Same with Deja Vu Galio. Deja Vu Augment essentially gives Galio a built-in Spear of Shojin and built-in every time you auto, you get ability power. So if you're not building double Rageblade on both of these champions, you're doing something severely wrong. Next up, we have Zilean. Zilean's a great utility unit. He's probably the best utility unit in the game right now. He's triple trait, which means he could fit in almost any comp, and he also has a stun on his ability. So what more can you ask for from a 2-cost support unit? Just throw a static shiv on him. If you really want to itemize him even more, throw a Spear Shojin or like an adaptive helm on him. He's going to be doing just fine. Tristana, pretty good as a 2-cost reroll blaster carry. What you want on Tristana, she's more of a caster, so Spear Shojin's really good on her. After that, getting like Queen's Crown is really nice because ideally if you 3-star someone, you want to buff them up as much as possible. So if you put the Fairy Crown on them, that's going to give them the most damage. And then last item could be Last Whisper if you need Last Whisper on your team, or it could be Infinity Edge because again, she's a casting unit. Next up, we have is Kog'Maw. Shojin, he's also a caster. Last Whisper, IE, pretty standard stuff there. Nothing too much to really deviate on that. Of course, if you build attack speed on Kog'Maw, you're still going to do fine, but I think this item combo is a bit better. Now we're on to tier 3s. Tier 3 units are still 3-starred if you want them to be your main carry because they often get outscaled by like a 2-star 4-cost. So for the tier 3 units, you're going to assume that they're 3-starred. For the tier 4 and 5, you're going to assume that they're 2-star. But for the tier 3 units, this is generally like the very expensive reroll comps. You typically only want to play this when you have like a ton of economy. But with that in mind, let's start out at the top. Shen is a utility unit. He's great because he gives you Pyro. Pyro loves getting stacks and you pretty much want to buff whoever your main Pyro carry is. However, Shen doesn't really use items that well because he's more of a CC unit. The way to balance CC units is to make them not scale as well with items. So that's why Shen, Tahm Kench, Zilean, they're going to make much better use of just having like random items. Maybe you put utility items on him like a Sunfire Cape. Maybe you just throw a Thieves Glove on him and call it a day, or you don't itemize him at all, even as a 3-star. Well, actually, if you 3-star him and he's like a cornerstone of your team, then yeah, put items on him. But if you're playing like a random comp and then you just happen to get a free 3-star Shen, don't stress too much about putting items on him because they don't do as much compared to like having it on your primary carry or your primary tank. Next up, we have Neeko, another support-ish unit, but she's still very tanky. I like putting my utility items on Neeko, so like Redemption, Sunfire, Ionic Spark are great to put on her, even Shroud. Mordekaiser uses similar items to Neeko, where I like to put utility items on Mordekaiser. However, Mordekaiser is sometimes like so tanky and he does a bit of damage that I want him to kind of do both, so that's why I like putting utility items on Mordekaiser. But of course, on both these champs, if you put like Warmogs, Bramble Vest, Dragonclaw, they're still going to do fine with those items. I just feel like the builds they fit in work a bit better with these items. For example, in like a Nami build with Eldritch Mordekaiser, you want the Ionic Spark to reduce people's magic resistance. And then if you run like a Vanguard frontline, having like a Redemption to heal the other Vanguards works out pretty decently. And then ideally, the Sunfire Cape burns them down a little bit. Neeko in a Shapeshifter build, like again, Ionic is going to be decent if you run like a Syndra behind them. Maybe if you're running like a Witchcraft comp and you're running Gwen as one of your carries from having the warrior buff with Fiora, Ionic Spark's going to be pretty decent on her. But Neeko does get outshined by better tanks. The Shapeshifter that is going to be Swain and Nasus are more suited to like primary tank items. For example, on Swain, we have like the classic like Warmog, Stoneplate, Redemption, like pure tank items there. I guess Redemption's kind of like a supportish item, but like on Swain, it's a pure tank item because Shapeshifters have so much health. Same story with Nasus over there. So because Neeko, the way she fits in the current trait system, she's kind of like second fiddle to both Swain and Nasus. Like if you want like a pure tank, Swain at 3 cost is going to be better, but of course Swain provides less utility. Nasus as a 4 cost, well, we always want to play around 4 cost, so that's why I want to use Nasus as my main tank. So that's kind of the difference between like Neeko and why she likes these items and Mordekaiser and why he likes the same items. We already talked about Swain. Now let's go on into Vex. Vex is very interesting. Vex gains bonus shielding when she is targeted by more people. So you want to isolate her in the front line. So doing like a double stone plate, not a bad build. Even like a triple stone plate probably works too. But I would build at least one stone plate on Vex, and then after that, Crown Guard is an incredible item on Vex because she is a mage after all. She loves ability power. What item gives ability power and gives you tankiness? Crown Guard. So it's like a hand-picked item for Vex essentially. After that, I like building the Ionic Spark because you're probably running mages whenever you're running Vex, or you're running Chrono with Karma. Getting the magic resist shredding is obviously going to be very good there. So Vex's item, I feel like, are a bit more important than some of these other people. Like Mordekaiser, if you throw Warmogs on him, he's going to be perfectly fine. You're not going to feel that much of a difference. But with Vex, I feel like getting perfect items on Vex actually does matter compared to some other units. So what does that mean when you're picking augments? Well, maybe if you're running a Vex comp, something like a Pandora's items might be worth a little more than when you're going Pandora's items with Nico or with Mordekaiser, or even Swain, because again, they don't really need particular items, whereas Vex and coincidentally Wukong need very particular items. Wukong loves Stoneplate even more than Vex does. Wukong literally scales off of resistances with his abilities, so if you're not building Stoneplate on him, you're doing something severely wrong. You want at least 2 on him, if not 3. Like, obviously it's hard to get 3, but like crazier things have happened before. Like, try to get 3. Again, I'm making this list to kind of assume that you're like taking items off carousel, and triple Stoneplate is going to be the best thing for Wukong. However, if you are spin to win Wukong, it kind of changes the way his ability scales. Stoneplate is still good because you still want him spinning around and hitting a lot of people, but adding in like a Bloodthirster and Titan's Resolve is going to be a bit better than going like a triple Stoneplate. Next up we have is Katarina. Oh boy, Katarina is one of the worst units in the first patch of the set, but in the second patch, she's still bad, but a bit more playable from before. What you really need from her is a lot of survivability and a lot of damage. The trouble with that is Edge and Knight is probably the best warrior item because warriors jump around a lot, so they get hit a lot. But Edge and Knight gives attack speed and attack damage, which is stats that Katarina doesn't need at all, so it's kind of wasted on her. Instead, you want to build survivability through a bunch of healing. Going like double-handed justice, jeweled gauntlet, probably going to be the best build for her. Hopefully she just kills everything, resets, etc, etc. Next up we have is Hecarim. In a Bastion build, getting a random 3-star Hecarim is absolutely incredibly strong. Items like Sterix Gauge is like hand-built for Hecarim because he attacks so much from multi-striker and he's in the front line a bunch. Titan's Resolve, same thing. Titan's Resolve is great for attack damage melee carries after the changes they made to it last set. And then of course, as a frontline bruiser, you want to have Bloodthirster, gives a big shield and gives him a bunch of survivability as well. Next up we have is the backline. Bard. Bard's a support unit. Just throw a static Shiv on him. There are some carry Bard builds, but like you only do it because he's your only option. Like obviously, if you don't get a random Bard 3, you're probably going to want to itemize someone else. No harm, no foul. He's a triple trait unit, and he also gives damage amp to whoever his ability hits. So he's a great support unit. As a primary carry, probably better things to itemize. Next up we have is Hui. Blue buff just makes Hui cast a ton, pretty low mana pool on him, and then Nashor's great for casting more, and then Hat's pretty good because he has a Blaster trait. Blaster trait gives damage amplification, so because of that, you want to build a lot of ability power to kind of scale off of that. Honorable mention to Jeweled Gauntlet because it kind of does the same thing and he gets a little bit of AP from Frost trait. Frost doesn't give like the most AP, so it's not one of those types of traits where you can like forego going any AP and just go Jeweled Gauntlet and have it clearly be the best item. Like there's some traits in the past where they give like only AP. I think the trait was called Arcanist, and in those builds, like yeah, Jeweled Gauntlet was by far the best item on them because they have so much AP and you want to multiply it, so why not get a crit item? But Frost doesn't give that much AP because it also gives a bunch of other stats as well, so building a hat on him is kind of tied with Jeweled Gauntlet in my opinion. Next one up we have is Veigar. Veigar does get built-in AP because whenever you buy charms he gets a bunch of ability power, so that's why you'd prefer stuff like Jeweled Gauntlet over hat on Veigar, though since he is a mage, hat still is a perfectly fine item. After that, blue buff absolutely mandatory, gets him to cast a ton and he's just a low mana pool unit. And then finish it off with a Nashor's Tooth there. One question a lot of people might have is like, do you want to build Spear of Shojin or Nashor's on a unit? Well, generally, if someone has around like 40 mana, I'd say that's like the break-even point where I say like, either or probably sounds good. Like I think Hui is around 40 mana, so blue buff or Shojin works around the same on Hui. I think blue buff is a little bit better. Maybe the cutoff is like 42.5, where if you're 45 mana, you want Spear of Shojin. If you are 40 mana, you want blue buff. But like around that area, it's kind of tied. You don't really care that much. You're really just building items to slam items to get more value out of them in the early game. But if you're ever wondering like, oh, on like Xerath, who has 120 mana, should I build blue buff or Shojin? Well, in that case, you definitely would prefer the Spear of Shojin. Next units up we have is Jinx and Ezreal, the two AD champions of tier 3. Let's start off with Jinx. Jinx doesn't really have an ability. It's like, I mean, she has an ability, but it gets her to like attack faster. It's not like a damage ability, where normally like Kog'Maw, he casts his ability, he throws a goo out and it does a bunch of damage, right? Jinx, she does have an ability, but it's more of a buff. So it makes her deal more damage on her attacks. So you want her to just attack as often as possible. Rage Blade's pretty good for that. Last Whisper is good because you want to reduce armor as she's a physical damage dealer. And then I really like Runons on Jinx. It helps her get resets a lot. So the way you want to position Jinx is have her and the rest of your damage dealers on like one side of the map. That way you focus down like a weak target. And then as they kill that, ideally the Runons kind of hits other people. And then since the next person is a bit lower, you're able to get the reset off of that. Another reason why Runons is good is because let's say you are playing Jinx and you position on the wrong side and you're hitting like their main tank and you can't kill them. It's going to take like 5 years to do it. Sometimes the Runons kills someone else or gets a takedown on someone else and then she gets the Hunter buff anyways. So that's kind of why Runons is a great item on Hunters in general. And also as primarily an auto attacker, it's another reason why it's really good on Jinx. I will note that Runons does not proc on hit effects, but the stats you get from Runons is really high. If you actually look at the numbers for like how much attack speed you get from Runons, how much attack damage you get from Runons, and you also incorporate like the effect of Runons, it's like a very efficient item. Again, it has to be because it's never like a main item. If you think of like Infinity Edge on Kog'Maw, like, yeah, that's pretty mandatory, right? But like Runons is never a mandatory item on anyone. So in order to balance for that, they make it a little bit better stat-wise. So building stuff like Runons, if you ever check out like stat websites, you'll notice that Runons always performs really well on a lot of people. And again, the reason why is because it's always like a optional item. So they have to kind of make it better than everything else. Next one up is going to be Ezreal. Ezreal is weird. Like he does no damage in a lot of cases. So what I like to do on him is just put a red buff on him, plus the Spear of Shojin, get him to cast a lot, apply red buff to the backline of the enemy team, and then hopefully someone else can finish off those units. Maybe when Ezreal gets buffed, you could go like full damage on him. Maybe you could do like Spear of Shojin, Infinity Edge, then like a Guard Breaker. That could be a very interesting build because he's going to do his cast, he's going to hit a shield off one of the tanks, and then maybe with the damage amplification that he gets from the Guard Breaker, he one-taps the backline. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up here. Or you go like Spear of Shojin, Deathblade, Infinity Edge. That could also work too. Hopefully that one taps the backline. But right now, I really like him as a red buff applier. I think there's nothing wrong with that. And then, of course, you want the Spear of Shojin on him to cast as much as possible. Now let's move on into tier 4s. Tier 4 is where we get a little bit juicier units because most team comps are built around 4-cost units, or like most traits are. So you're going to see these units in most of your games, and you're probably going to play around them the most. Let's start off with the best tank in the game. I think it's Nasus. He's just so disgusting. If you think about like pure tank stats, like, wow. What he gets from Shapeshifter is so much health, and then you just stack more like scaling health items on him, such as Warmogs and Redemption. Round that off with some resistances with Stoneplate. Like, what could go wrong, you know? By the way, Bastions and Shapeshifters kind of itemize in different ways. Since you get so much bonus HP from Shapeshifters, like resistances become a lot more valuable in terms of effective HP. But because Shapeshifters also scale off of percent health, getting like a Warmogs is still really good on them, ironically. Bastions, on the other hand, they get a lot of resistances, so you want to stack them up with a bunch of health. That way you get more value out of the resistances that you get from the Bastion buff. Kind of one of those like minor itemization optimizations that people should be trying to do a bit more, but it's just something to keep in the back of your head when you're deciding on certain items in the late game. But yeah, on Nasus, like same items as Swain, just like the pure health tank items. Just because he's a shapeshifter is going to be really good. Taric, I like using him as a support item holder or as like a utility tank. So I like putting my Redemption on him, Sunfire Cape, Ionic Spark. He's often played in Portal comps, so that's why you want the Ionic Spark to buff up your Rise. He's another unit that you want kind of in the middle of your team because he absorbs projectiles, so you don't want him on the side because he might miss some of them. So that's why utility items work really well on Taric. Rakan, very similarly enough, does similar things to Taric. You also want Rakan in the middle of your team because he has an ability where he throws out a shield to units within 2 hexes of him. So you want as many units getting hit by that as possible. So again, Sunfire Cape, Redemption, throw him in the middle. If you're an attack damage comp with Callista, throw an Even Shroud on him. If you're a mage comp, if you're running like Preserver Karma, for example, throw Ionic Spark on him. That's going to be the main role of Rakan because he's kind of like a middle area buff guy. Next one up we have is Tahm Kench. He's a bit interesting. Despite being a 4-cost unit, he's not that tanky compared to Rakan, Taric, and Nasus. But what he is good at is crowd controlling. So Getting Protector's Vow on him is probably the best item you can build on him, but you don't want to throw too many items on your Tahm Kench unless he's like your only tank available. If he's your only tank available, then yeah, you got to do what you got to do. But let's say you are running a comp where you have Nasus with 2 Shapeshifter and Tahm Kench with 2 Vanguard, both of them 2-star. I would throw all my main items on Nasus and then throw all my like mana items such as Adaptive Helm and Protector's Vow on Tahm Kench. And if I don't have that, just throw like whatever leftovers I have on him, because Tahm Kench, you really just want him to get his stun off. After that, he doesn't really do anything else. So just get him off and then don't call him back the night after. Next one up we have is Olaf. He's really good with bruiser items. He loves Edge of Night. He loves Bloodthirster, he loves Sterak's Gauge, he also likes Titan's Resolve. I'd say all 4 of these items are kind of tied. It depends what state of the game you're in. Again, I talked about this before. BT Titans, absolutely incredible combo in the early to mid game. However, in the late game, a lot of melee frontliners can't live that long, even with that item combo, so you need the Edge of Night on them if you want them to actually survive in the late game. So in games where you're playing for first place, Edge of Night is an incredible item. In games where you're trying to play for like top 4, maybe you want like BT Titan Sterak's, for example. That's kind of how you decide between some of these items. Like some games, you really need the Edge of Night, some games you really don't. And it depends on what teams you're facing at the time. Like again, if a team is not scaled enough to kill Olaf outright, getting him to stack with a Titan's Resolve is really, really powerful because he's just going to run through all those teams, right? But if they're able to kill him before he stacks or he can't really out heal their damage, then those items start to become much less important. Honorable mention to Even Shroud on Olaf. Olaf is often played with the Varus comp in like the Frostfire build. And because you want some sort of physical armor reduction in that comp, getting an Even Shroud on Olaf is really nice because it gives him a bunch of tank stats and he kind of works as like a secondary carry than a primary carry in those cases. You could argue that in Frost builds, you get armor reduction from playing Twitch, but since Twitch is a 1 cost that you don't itemize, he oftentimes just dies to random AoEs. So if you want that armor shredding throughout like the long parts of the fight, then you want to throw an Even Shroud on your Olaf. Next up we have is Fiora. She builds very similarly to Olaf. In fact, I think like every item they build is the same except for Even Shroud. I don't really care too much for that on Fiora because the way Fiora's ability works is she gets a lot of durability. I think it's like 70% damage reduction whenever she casts her spell. So she's naturally very tanky. That's why I really like having Titan's Resolve on her. And even though I said Edge of Night was such a great item on all these melee bruisers, I'm actually going to make an exception for Fiora. I think it's just like decent on her. It's like very good, but I'd much rather have like BT Titans and Sterak's because she normally is durable enough to live through all that nonsense in the late game once she casts her ability. Next up we have is Gwen. Gwen likes to stack. She likes to get a lot of cuts on people, and the more cuts that she gets, the more that she does later on. So every time she casts, she makes every future cast a bit better. So because of that, I think Blue Buff is a very underbuilt and underrated item on Gwen. The reason why it's underbuilt is because she's often played with Karma. So if you have a blue buff, you're putting it on Karma because that's by far Karma's best item, right? Whereas Gwen, blue buff is great on her, but you could build all sorts of other nonsense on her instead. So Gwen's items are super flexible. You could build the items you see here, like blue buff, Hand of Justice plus Jeweled Gauntlet, just a bunch of damage. You could also build her as a tank with like Crown Guard and Ionic Spark if you need her for like more frontline. And there are also much wackier builds such as putting like Edge of Night Bloodthirsters on her. I've actually seen that work out really, really well because she actually makes use of the attack speed from the Edge of Night. If you contrast that with Katarina, Katarina doesn't really use the attack speed that well because she's mostly just spinning around most of the time. Whereas Gwen, getting attack speed allows her to cast more, which again makes her stack a bit faster. And of course, the Edge of Night effect is why you get the item. It makes her invulnerable or like untargetable for a certain amount of time. So if you're ever afraid of getting blown up, that's like a pretty good item to put on her. But pretty much like she uses every AP item and she uses every melee bruiser item. So she's kind of like the perfect flex 4-cost champion. Like the only items that I could think of that you can't build on Gwen, let's go through all the items that Gwen can use. She could use Quicksilver, sure. Titans, sure. Jeweled Gauntlet, sure. Red buff, I'm not happy about it, but probably skip on that. Skip these next few. Ionic, yes. Steadfast, I think she could actually use Steadfast pretty decently. Not the best on her, but like, again, it's buildable. Guardbreaker is buildable. Archangel's buildable. Thieves' Glove's buildable. Bloodthirster's buildable, Nasher's buildable, Hodge good, Hextech Gunblade decent, Crown Guard good, Edge of Night good. Honestly, even a Protector's Vow might not even be the worst thing on her. Blue buff good, probably skip the Sterak's, and then Adaptive Helm good, Shojin decent, Morello probably playable, and then Hat good, Giant Slayer good. Like she pretty much uses most of those items out there, which again is why I think she's one of the best 4-cost flex units, and she also fits in a lot of different comps. You don't really need to build around her that hard. But let's move on into the AP units down here. Karma, blue buff, mandatory because she's a low mana count user, and then red buff, really good to apply the buff to a lot of different people. I like it more than Morello because you get the attack speed on red buff. You really just want to spread it as quickly as possible. And because there's attack speed on red buff and no attack speed on Morello, I like the red buff a bit more on her, but of course they're very interchangeable. And then last item, since she likes really long fights, normally damage dealers that like long fights love Hextech Gunblade because they generally scale into the fight. So as the fight goes longer and longer, she puts her ability on more and more units. And because of that, the damage adds up very quickly towards the end of the fight, and then Hextech Gunblade becomes very, very good. Of course, you could also put like a damage item here instead, like a Rabadon's Death Cap or whatever you have. That'll work fine too. Like the third item doesn't really matter in my opinion. Next one up we have is Nami. Nami's a CC unit, so you want her to cast as much as possible. With the mage buff, blue buff is really good. I think she's 40 mana, so getting the blue buff, it's like right below the tiebreaker threshold right there. But ironically, like building both like blue buff and Shojin is really nice because again, you really just play her for her CC. She does do a ton of damage still, but like the CC is the really devastating part. So getting 2 mana items on her is really nice. And then of course, red buff gets her to cast faster. She's a CC unit, not so much a damage unit. So I like that more than Morello. They might need to give Morello a bit more AP because in this set, like a lot of the casters that normally would like Morello prefer the red buff, at least in my opinion. Rise, same story. He loves auto attacking because he gets the scholar buff. So you don't need to build a Spear of Shojin on Rise. He's one of the exceptions there. He's one of the few caster units that doesn't need a mana item. That's because he's played with Scholar and he's got a big mana pool, so blue buff doesn't really do anything on him. Like Zoe, you could still build blue buff on Zoe and Ari because they have low mana pools, but Rise has a bit of a bigger one. So you just want to build a lot of attack speed on Rise. Rageblade, red buff, he hits 4 units, red buff's pretty solid, and then just some random AP item. Hat, Archangels, gonna be great on him. Jeweled Gauntlet, or damage amp items such as like Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker work fantastically on Rise. I don't know if that's a word. Fantastically? No, that's probably not a word. Next up we have is Varus. He's an AD caster, so he really likes having Spear of Shojin, Infinity Edge, and Last Whisper. Last Whisper could be replaced if you have like Even Shroud on your Olaf or like a Last Whisper on someone else. If that is the case, something like a Deathblade, Giant Slayer would work great on Varus, but I think Spear of Shojin is almost mandatory on him. He's mainly like a casting unit. Like, yeah, his auto attacks still deal a bunch of damage, but primarily, he's going to be doing most of his damage off his cast. Again, that's why IE is preferred. And then next up, we have is Callista. Always run Fairy Crown on Callista whenever she's your carry. And then, again, we talked about this in the beginning. Her best build depends on what you're playing her with. If you're playing like 7 or 9 multi-striker, you don't need the Rageblade. You much rather have like Deathblade, Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, things like that. But if you're playing her in 6 Fairy, you definitely want the Rageblade so that she gets more attacks off, which enhances her ability a lot more. Third item, it's really variable. She kind of uses any damage item. I like having Last Whisper on her just because like she's always my last unit alive in a lot of cases. So you don't want to put Last Whisper on someone else, have them die, and then she can't shred the tank anymore. So that's why I just like having the quote unquote like support item or like utility item on my main carry sometimes. Like there's a special exception for Last Whisper. Next one up is going to be the tier 5 units. These are like the most fun units to play around, I guess. But all of these units fill really odd roles. Like you don't build your team around a 5-cost unit. You do it more so around like a 2-star 4-cost or like a 3-star 1, 2, or 3-cost. But 5-cost units are very great at adding utility to your team and as like a splash unit, as like a random thing to add in the late game. But assuming these are all 2-star, these are going to be fantastic items on them. Crown Guard, Morgana, she's like a frontline mage item. Morgana is very interesting. She makes great use of both tank items and ability power items. Actually, let's group Diana in that group as well. They both kind of fulfill the same role, where they seem like they're tanks because one's a preserver, one's a bastion, but they actually work better with ability power items. So if you have the choice in a perfect world, whether you choose ability power items or tank items, I would choose ability power items on them. Tank items, however, are still very fine. Like if you have extra tank items and that's all you have, like definitely throw them on Morgana 2, Diana 2. They're going to do fantastic with them. But having like Crown Guard, Ionic Spark on them, they're probably like one of the 2 best holders of these items. After that, since Morgana has a big AoE, I like having Morello on her. It's better than red buff because I like getting AP on my Morgana, and then the attack speed isn't that important on her, whereas the attack speed on like Karma and Nami are pretty important. Diana, I like having Bloodthirster on her because she jumps really dangerously into the enemy lines, and Bloodthirster just allows her to heal a lot of that damage up. You could argue that Morello might be a good item on Diana because she has an AoE ability, and it is fine. Like, I'm not going to complain if I have a Morello on my Diana. However, I find that she often just like kills the people she damages, whereas Morgana doesn't. So that's why I like the Bloodthirster a lot more on Diana than like a Morello. Next one up we have is Briar and Camille. These are the two like melee bruiser units that are typically in the game, so the same bullcrap can be built on them, like Bloodthirster, Sterex, Quicksilver, Edge and Knight, Titan's Resolve. All those items work great on them. I really like Quicksilver on Briar though, because Briar CCs the enemy team in an AoE, so just getting that off guaranteed is really high value for me. After that, getting like Bloodthirster, Sterex, perfectly fine items for any frontline bruiser, but especially good on Briar because you're often running Shapeshifter with her, and Sterex scales off of max health, and Bloodthirster also scales off of max health, so it's kind of like a no-brainer to add those in. Next up we have is Camille. Edge and Knight, incredible on her because she's kind of a little more delicate than Briar, so I like having the Edge and Knight, but of course like the Titans and the Sterex and the Bloodthirster are still really good on Camille. Next up we have is the backline. Milio's just like a support unit. I mean, Milio throws items to your team, right? So like Milio can never be a primary carry unless they overbuff Milio. So getting like a Spear of Shojin, getting Milio to cast as much as possible, gonna be great for him. After that, Nashor, same thing, get him to cast more. And then Static Shiv, great utility item. I can't really argue with these three in the backline there. Nora and Yumi. Nora's also kind of a support unit, but Nora's one of the best Morello appliers in the game because with Mage, Nora throws out 2 giant pools or something like that, and it just like hits a ton of units. So getting like a Shojin plus Morello on her is going to be really dangerous. But I find that Nora doesn't like solo carry games. So that's why I put more of the supportish items on the Nora. Add the Static Shiv there if you really want. So it's kind of like a very similar build to the Milio. Next one up we have is Xerath. Xerath's a bit of an interesting case. So Xerath normally builds Spear of Shojin a lot. I've seen that a lot, but I don't actually think it's like the best item on Xerath. I think what you want is to get Xerath to cast with an Archangels going and just have like a very massive front line. And getting that initial cast off really quickly doesn't matter that much. The reason why this is because ability power scales so well on Xerath. So I would build like Archangels and Rabadon's Death Cap before Spear of Shojin on him, just to make sure that his ability actually kills whoever he hits. We've all seen our 1-star Xerath throw out like 20 bullets at people and it seems like he did no damage. It's probably because you only had a Spear of Shojin on him instead of ability power, and Xerath scales incredibly well off of ability power. Probably the best one in the game. I forget what the exact numbers are, but they apply to each and every one of his shots, and he shoots like 20 of them. So it just scales incredibly well. Just trust me on this, like try it out yourself. Throw Archangels on him over a Shojin, you'll never regret it. So now for Xerath's mana item, should you even build Spear of Shojin? I think actually Adaptive Helm is better, and I'm going to show you why. So doing out the math, I rarely do this. I rarely do the math, but I feel like it's important this time. Assuming you have 2 tier items on Xerath so that they start out with 30 mana, which is what you get from Shojin and Archangels or Adaptive Helm and Archangels, you normally need 9 auto attacks to get him to cast. And the reason why is because you start off with 30 mana, he has 120 total mana, and you get 10 mana per auto attack. That's going to take 11.25 seconds because he has a 0.8 attack speed. So he autos every 1.25 seconds. Now, Spear of Shojin gives him 15 mana per auto attack instead of 10. So he reaches this in 7.5 seconds. Adaptive Helm, however, gets him to cast at 8.75 seconds, so you only need 1 more auto to cast when you have adaptive than Spear of Shojin. So you might be thinking to yourself like, hey, doesn't that mean Spear of Shojin is still better then because you get your cast off earlier? Wrong. What actually ends up happening is that you get more ability power from Adaptive Helm. So Spear of Shojin, this one gives 20 ability power, 20 attack damage, and 15 mana. However, Adaptive Helm, this one gives 15 ability power, 20 magic resist, and 15 mana. So the attack damage is useless and the magic resistance is pretty much useless. So they both give 15 ability power. So Shojin gives 20 ability power and Adaptive Helm gives 15 ability power. However, if you're in the back 2 rows, you gain an additional 20 ability power. So you actually get 35 instead of the 20 that you get from Spear of Shojin. So getting that extra AP when AP is the most important stat on Xerath, I'm going to prefer that over the Spear of Shojin. So it's a very small difference, but again, if I'm picking off Carousel, I think I would prefer that a bit more. Last but not least, let's talk about Smolder. So Smolder is a complete moron because Smolder just runs to the enemy backline and gets hit by everything. So you need some sort of healing on Smolder. So getting a Hextech Gunblade, very important. arguably even a Bloodthirster because you need the shielding on Smolder, maybe. In some cases, yes, some cases, no. Apart from that, Smolder's very good at auto-attacking, so getting a Rage Blade is the best thing you could build on Smolder. And then getting a Death Blade, because you don't really care about critting that much, you don't need IE, Death Blade's going to be a lot better. And Death Blade, for some reason, shows up in a lot of late-game carousels. I don't know if that's just like a coincidence or if it's actually a thing, but I really like taking Deathblade off the carousel in the late game for Smolder if I'm ever in that situation. But of course, Smolder can use all sorts of different items like Giant Slayer, Last Whisper, Guard Breaker, like almost anything. But hopefully this kind of sums up what you should be building on each champion and why, and kind of understanding like the ins and outs. So even if you build a suboptimal item on a champion, it doesn't mean it's bad because some games calls for that. For example, unlike Kog'Maw, if you have Even Shroud on your Nunu, you do not need the Last Whisper on your Kog'Maw. So no matter what the data says, like Last Whisper good, if you have the Even Shroud already, you could build something else, like build like a Giant Slayer or whatever you want. Some games you don't get specific items that you want. If you're playing Karma and you really want blue buff on Karma, but you only get one tier that game, getting a Spear Shojin is more than good enough. You shouldn't grief your game to greed your items, because if you just hold that tier and pray for another tier later on and you never get it, like you're just gonna lose that game. So some games you're gonna have to build Spear Shojin on Karma and you might even win that game. So I highly recommend, if you wanna learn more about that, like read all the item tips on this site. It's going to be on bunnymuffins.lol. You click on items up there because, again, like there are a lot of exceptions to a lot of these rules. I just wanted to showcase why you want to build certain items on certain champions. And hopefully this video kind of helps out with that. But that's going to be it for me today. This video was already way too long. But like, again, you could read through this or go over this in your own time. But hopefully everyone enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something new. Leave a comment. What's something that you did not know before watching this video? And I hope to see you all next time.